There are fates worse than death, and I learned this truth long before I learned how to scream without a voice. My name was Elias Cord. I was a man once, a citizen of the Imperium. A name written in ink on a hab register, and spoken aloud by a woman who believed that tomorrow would be kinder than today. I believed it too. That was my first crime. They tell me I am a prisoner, but that word is too small to contain what has been done to me. Prisoners are meant to be held, fed, perhaps punished, and then released or executed. I have been neither released nor executed. I have been processed. I have been catalogued. I have been reduced to a function that exists only to endure. I do not know the exact day my life ended, because no one marked it as such. There was no ceremony, no pronouncement of guilt, no final words spoken over me. One moment I was standing in the transit queue beneath Hive Karsus, counting ration chits and worrying about the ache in my left knee. In the next I was on my knees with my face pressed against ferrocrete, a boot on the back of my neck, and a voice reciting charges I could barely hear over the crowd screaming around me. Heresy is a broad word in the Imperium. It stretches to cover whatever the Imperium requires it to cover. In my case, it was association. A man I worked beside in the manufactorum had been overheard questioning a tithe increase. I had shared a meal with him. I had laughed at something he said. That was enough. Guilt, like faith, is contagious. They bound my hands with shock manacles and dragged me through corridors I had cleaned for years but never truly seen. I remember thinking with a strange and stupid calm that someone would notice the mistake, that a clerk would check a slate, frown, and say my name had been taken in error, that the Imperium, vast and terrible though it was, could still be corrected if one simply waited long enough. Waiting is another word that has lost all meaning to me. The holding cells beneath the hive are not meant for comfort, but even that description is a lie. They are not meant for people at all. They are narrow stone boxes, damp with condensation and older things, stacked one atop another like coffins that never quite seal. The air tasted of rust and fear. I could hear others around me, coughing, praying, muttering names into the dark as if those names might anchor them to the world they were already slipping away from. Time passed, or perhaps it did not. There are no lights in the cells, only the slow cycle of exhaustion and waking terror. Hunger came first, then thirst, then the dull, constant ache of muscles locked in place. Somewhere in the dark, a woman began to scream. She screamed until her voice failed, and then she continued anyway, a raw animal sound that scraped at my mind until I wished I could tear my own ears from my skull. When the door finally opened, the light burned. I remember that vividly. It felt like being flayed through the eyes. Hands seized me, rough and practiced, and hauled me upright. I tried to speak. I wanted to say my name, to say there had been a mistake, to say anything at all. A shock baton answered me, and I learned that silence was safer. They marched us in lines through processing halls that stretched beyond sight. Cogitators chattered, servo skulls drifted overhead, lenses clicking as they recorded faces, scars, signs of useful physicality. I saw people pulled from the line and dragged away, their protests swallowed by machinery. I never saw them again. I still do not know if they were fortunate. A robed figure with a metal face stopped in front of me. Augmetic eyes whirred as they focused. Cold instruments pressed against my skin. Data slates chimed. Civilian, the thing said, its voice layered with vox distortion. Non-essential skill set. Adequate physical resilience. It paused, as if considering something. Designation, penal labor asset. That was when my name finally died. They shaved my head. They burned a number into my shoulder with a brand that smelled like cooked meat. They injected me with something that made my thoughts slow and thick, like drowning in warm oil. When I woke again, I was no longer beneath the hive. I was on a prison transport, bound for a place whose name I would come to curse even in my dreams. The ship had once been a cargo hauler. Its holds had been stripped and reinforced, filled with tier upon tier of restraint frames where we were locked upright, unable to sit, unable to lie down. Life support wheezed like a dying animal. The walls were etched with old scratches, tally marks, prayers carved deep enough to chip ceramite. Some of them were centuries old. I learned then that the Imperium does not waste anything, not metal, not flesh, not suffering. Days blurred together as the ship translated through the warp. I knew this because the screaming started then. Not the screaming of prisoners, but something else, something distant and vast, echoing through the hull like the universe itself was in pain. I pressed my forehead against cold steel and tried not to listen. Some did not manage that. I saw a man 2 frames down from me begin to laugh. It started quietly, a breathy chuckle, and grew until his whole body shook against his restraints. He laughed for hours. When he finally fell silent, he did not move again. The guards left him there, his corpse swaying gently with the ship's motion, until we arrived. The planet had no sky worth naming. Ash clouds blotted out the sun, turning everything the color of old bruises. We were herded out under gunfire and dogs that were barely recognizable as such. Their flesh bowed with iron and augmetics. Towers loomed in the distance, smoke pouring from their crowns like funeral pyres that never burned out. This was a labor world. This was where civilians went when the Imperium decided their lives still had value, but only as fuel. They marched us into the camps, and I felt something inside me finally crack. Not my will, not yet. Something softer, something that had still believed survival meant living. I was assigned to a work gang within the hour. No rest, no orientation, just a heavy tool pressed into my hands and a gesture toward a trench filled with black sludge that steamed in the cold air. Dig, the overseer said. I dug until my hands bled, and then until I could no longer feel them. I dug while the man beside me collapsed and was beaten until he stood again. I dug while another fell and did not stand, and was dragged away without comment. I dug as the sky darkened further and floodlights snapped on, harsh and unforgiving. At some point, I realized I was no longer thinking in full sentences. Thoughts became simple commands. Lift, strike, breathe, endure. Sleep when it came was not rest. We were herded into barracks that stank of unwashed bodies and despair, given a thin gruel that tasted of chemicals, and allowed a few hours to collapse onto metal bunks, stacked 6 high. Dreams were worse than waking. In them I was free, and the waking after was a fresh cruelty. Days became weeks, weeks became something else. My body changed, weight fell away, muscles hardened, scars layered over scars. The number burned into my shoulder became more familiar to me than my own face, which I rarely saw reflected in anything but oily puddles. Punishment was constant and arbitrary. A missed quota, a stumble, a glance held too long on an overseer. I learned to keep my eyes down, my movements efficient, my mind as empty as I could make it. Even so, pain found me again and again, as it did everyone. Once during a ration distribution, a man tried to steal an extra portion. They caught him. They did not kill him. Killing is quick, and quick things are precious. They tied him to a post in the center of the yard and let us watch as servitors went to work, removing pieces of him with surgical precision while he screamed. When it was done, what remained was taken away, and we were ordered back to work. No one spoke of it afterward. We did not need to. I do not know how long I have been here now. Time erodes differently in places like this. I know only that I am still alive, and that survival has become a habit I no longer remember choosing. Sometimes, when exhaustion loosens its grip just enough, I remember my old name, Elias Cord. I turn it over in my mind like a relic from a lost age. It feels fragile, dangerous. I am careful with it, because in the Imperium of man, hope is not a comfort, it is a liability. Hope dies slowly here. It does not scream when it goes. It thins like blood diluted with water, until one day you realize it is gone, and you cannot remember when you last felt it. I think that is the true genius of this place. Not the brutality, not the machines, but the patience. There came a day when I stopped counting the dead. At first, each one had mattered. I noticed faces, remembered voices, marked the absence of men and women who had slept within arm's reach of me the night before. I told myself it was important to remember them, that forgetting would be another kind of murder. That conviction lasted until it became too heavy to carry. People vanish here in dozens of ways. Accidents, exhaustion, discipline, reassignment. Some are taken to places we are not allowed to see. Buildings surrounded by higher walls and thicker guns, where the screams are different, quieter, more deliberate. Others simply collapse into the mud and are left there until the next shift change, when servitors come to scrape what remains into carts like waste material. The first time I stepped over a body without stopping, something inside me recoiled. The 10th time, I barely noticed. The 100th time, I adjusted my stride so I would not slip on the blood. This is what survival looks like when stripped of dignity. The work never changes, only its shape. 1 month it is digging trenches for pipelines that carry something corrosive and glowing from one end of the continent to the other. Another it is hauling macro shell casings, larger than hab blocks, their surfaces etched with prayers we are not permitted to read aloud. They sent us into the ruins of an old city to salvage plasteel from buildings that had collapsed centuries ago. The ghosts of that place felt thicker than the air. It was there that I saw the Emperor's justice enacted up close. A man in our gang had been a teacher once. I knew this because he had told me during one of the rare moments when we were not being watched too closely. He spoke quietly, carefully, as if afraid that remembering his past too vividly might summon it like a curse. He had been arrested for teaching children to read from a text that was not properly sanctified. During the salvage operation, a section of floor gave way beneath him. He fell 2 levels, shattering his leg. The scream that tore out of him was not loud, but it was pure, a sound of a life breaking cleanly in half. We gathered around him instinctively. That was our second mistake. The first had been caring. The overseer arrived with a pair of Skitarii escorts, their movements precise and utterly devoid of hesitation. The teacher was still alive, clutching at us, begging for help he did not expect to receive. The overseer did not look at him. Instead, it looked at us. "Labor unit disruption detected," it said. One of the Skitarii raised its weapon and shot the man beside me through the head. The body fell forward, twitching, blood spraying my boots. I remember the warmth of it, seeping through the cracked leather, and how absurdly human that detail felt in a moment so inhuman. "Return to task," the overseer said. We did. The teacher was left where he lay. When we came back the next day, he was gone. In his place was a dark stain and a replacement worker who did not ask questions. There are nights when I dream of that moment, of the way my hands stayed at my sides while someone died because I was afraid. In the dream I try to move, to shout, to do something that might justify my continued existence. I never do. Eventually something new entered my life. Fear had always been there, a constant companion, but this was different. This was anticipation. I was selected. Selection is not random, no matter what the guards tell themselves. They watch us. They catalog our endurance, our obedience, the way we flinch or do not flinch under punishment. One day a red mark appeared next to my number on the slate. 2 days later I was pulled from my bunk before shift and marched to a facility at the edge of the camp. The building was cleaner than the others. That alone made it terrifying. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and burning incense. Servo arms hung from the ceiling like metallic spiders, twitching as we passed beneath them. I was strapped to a chair that reclined whether I wanted it to or not. Restraints locked around my wrists, ankles, chest, and skull. A tech priest approached me, its robes whispering across the floor. I could see scraps of skin between its augmetics, gray and unhealthy, etched with circuitry and scars. It regarded me the way one might regard a malfunctioning tool. "Your durability exceeds baseline projections," it said. "Your continued survival indicates suitability." "For what?" I asked, before I could stop myself. The shock came immediately, a white-hot agony that arced through my nerves and left me gasping. The tech priest tilted its head, considering me. "Vocalization not required," it said. "You are to be improved." They did not tell me what they did next. They did not need to. I felt it. Fluids burned through my veins. Machines whined and clicked as they measured reactions I could not control. At some point I screamed until my throat tore, and then I screamed anyway. I lost track of how many times I blacked out. Each time I woke, something had changed. When they were finished, they unstrapped me and let me collapse onto the floor. My body shook uncontrollably. My vision swam with data overlays that faded only slowly. "Return to labor," the tech priest said. I did. The difference revealed itself over the following weeks. I tired less quickly. Wounds closed faster. Pain dulled to something distant, manageable. The overseers noticed. I was worked harder, pushed further, tested. I understood then what selection meant. I was no longer just labor. I was an investment. And investments are not allowed to break easily. There is a particular horror in realizing that the Imperium does not merely tolerate your suffering. It depends on it. My endurance fed a system so vast that my individual agony was meaningless, and yet my continued function was essential. I had become useful. Sometimes as I worked beneath a sky that never cleared, I imagined what would happen if the chains of supply ever failed. If all of us simply stopped. The thought was almost intoxicating. It never lasted, because each of us knows deep down that the Imperium would not notice our absence as rebellion, only as a shortage. Shortages are corrected. That is the final lesson every prisoner learns, whether they understand it or not. The camp expanded around us like a living thing. New barracks rose, new processing lines were installed, new transports arrived, with fresh bodies, eyes still bright with terror and disbelief. I watched them arrive the way a veteran watches recruits march toward a battlefield he already knows they will not survive. I stopped trying to warn them. Warnings require hope, and hope is a currency I no longer possessed. Instead, I watched myself change. The modifications the tech priests had made were not done for my comfort. My sleep grew shallow and fragmented. I could go for days on ration pace that would have killed me months earlier. Pain became something I noted rather than felt, like a warning rune flashing in the corner of my awareness. When injuries came, and they always came, my body responded with an efficiency that no longer felt entirely human. I began to suspect that some of what kept me alive no longer belonged to me. That suspicion became certainty the first time I was reassigned. We were marched out beyond the perimeter of the camp, past warning signs written in half a dozen dead languages, to a complex carved directly into the bedrock. The ground vibrated constantly there, a low, rhythmic thrum that traveled up through my bones. Even before we entered, I could smell it. Oil, ozone, and something faintly organic, like meat left too long in a sealed container. This facility was not for production, it was for correction. Inside, we were divided again. Those who resisted were stunned and dragged away. Those who did not were rewarded with survival. I was placed in a smaller group and led into a chamber dominated by a single machine the size of a HAB unit. Chains and cables hung from it like viscera. A throne-like apparatus sat at its center, surrounded by data pylons and restraint arms. A Magos addressed us, its voice booming through the chamber. "Some of you have failed the Imperium," it said. "Some of you have disappointed it. But disappointment is a form of inefficiency, and inefficiency can be remedied." I understood then why the building had been so clean. One by one, they took us forward. I watched a woman I recognized from my work gang strapped into the machine. She thrashed and screamed until the restraints tightened, and her body stilled. Lights flared, the air filled with the smell of burning hair. When they removed her, she did not scream anymore. She did not speak either. She walked when told to walk. She stood when told to stand. Her eyes tracked movement without comprehension. A servitor badge had been bolted into her chest, still slick with blood. When my turn came, I did not fight. That is another truth I carry like a wound. I could have resisted. I could have screamed, thrashed, begged. It would have changed nothing. I knew this. And so I sat, and I let them strap me down, and I stared at the ceiling while the machine descended. The pain was exquisite. It was not the blunt agony of punishment, or the sharp clarity of injury. This was intimate. It reached into me, into places I did not know how to protect, and rearrange them. Memories surfaced unbidden, my childhood HAB, my mother's voice, the smell of recycled air and boiled grain. Each recollection was seized, examined, and either catalogued or erased. I remember the moment I tried to hold on to my name, Elias Cord. I repeated it in my mind like a prayer. The machine responded with a surge that made my vision go white. When I came back to myself, the name felt distant, like something I had once read rather than lived. When it was over, they unstrapped me and stood me on my feet. I swayed, but I did not fall. Retention acceptable, the Magos said. Cognitive degradation within projected limits. I was returned to the camp. I noticed the changes almost immediately. Orders slipped into my thoughts before they were spoken aloud. My body moved when commanded, even when my mind hesitated. I could still think, still remember, but but something had been placed between thought and action, a gate that no longer belonged to me. I had not become a servitor, not fully. I had become something worse, a prisoner who could still understand his chains. This new existence settled over me like a second skin. I worked longer shifts, in more dangerous environments, because my reaction times were faster and my compliance absolute. I watched others falter and break and be recycled into components I did not ask about. I survived. Survival ceased to feel like victory. There were moments, rare, fragile moments, when the conditioning slipped. When I would catch my reflection in polished metal and see my eyes tracking something that my conscious mind had not noticed yet. When my hands would move to obey an order before the overseer finished speaking. Those moments terrified me more than any beating ever had. Because pain ends, this did not. I do not know what year it is now. I do not know how old I am. I know only that the Imperium still needs me, and so I remain. Sometimes during the brief intervals they allow us to stand idle while machines recalibrate, I look at the sky. The ash clouds part occasionally, just enough to reveal a dull, distant star. I wonder if it can see me. I wonder if somewhere far away, someone still believes that being a citizen of the Imperium means being protected by it. If they do, I hope they never learn the truth. Because there are fates worse than death, and I am still living one. Living is a generous word for what I do now. Existing is closer. Functioning, perhaps. The Imperium prefers language that does not invite sympathy. After the correction facility, days no longer blurred in quite the same way. My internal sense of time sharpened, regimented into work cycles and rest intervals that aligned too neatly with the camp schedules to be coincidence. I would wake seconds before the sirens. I would stand before the shock prods touched me. I would lift when ordered, stop when ordered, bleed only when permitted. The overseers approved. Approval, in this place, is a quiet thing. It is the absence of punishment. It is being ignored. I learned to treasure being ignored. How much more usefulness I would have to demonstrate before my mind was deemed surplus to requirements. That question haunted me. The station ran on shifts that never truly ended. Artificial lighting cycled to simulate days, but my body no longer trusted such lies. Fatigue came and went in waves dictated by chemistry rather than clocks. Sometimes I would find myself standing motionless, tools in hand, my mind gone utterly blank for seconds or minutes at a time. When awareness returned, my work would be done. I did not remember doing it. This frightened me enough that I tried to resist it once. I focused on my breathing. I concentrated on the feel of metal beneath my fingers, the sound of distant machinery, the ache in my joints. I told myself that if I stayed present, I would remain myself. The system corrected me. A sharp pulse lanced through my skull, dropping me to my knees. Warning runes flickered across my vision, red and unforgiving. I understood then that whatever had been done to me was no longer passive. It was watching. After that, I stopped trying. There are moments, rare and unguarded, when the conditioning loosens just enough to allow something like reflection. During one such moment, I found myself standing beside an observation viewport, looking out at the dead world below. Its surface was pocked with craters, scars from weapons tests conducted long ago. Even from orbit, it looked exhausted. I wondered if it remembered being whole. The tech adept stood beside me, silent for a long time. Eventually it spoke, its tone almost conversational. "You were not born to this," it said. The statement startled me more than any threat could have. "No," I replied before thinking. "I wasn't." The adept's augmetic eye rotated, focusing on me. "Birth assignments are irrelevant. Current function is all that matters." "Do you ever think about what you were?" I asked. The question felt dangerous the moment it left my mouth. The adept paused. "Occasionally," it said. "It is inefficient." Then it turned and walked away, leaving me alone with a view of a world that had been hollowed out and discarded. I began to understand something then, something that settled into me with terrible clarity. The Imperium does not hate its civilians. Hate requires attention, emotion, investment. The Imperium simply uses them. And when use is no longer optimal, it changes the shape of the user until it is. I do not know how much longer I will remain as I am. I can feel the edges of myself fraying, memories slipping into inaccessible corners, emotions flattening into data points. I still remember my name, but it no longer feels anchored. Elias Cord. A sound, a label. One day that too will be taken. When that happens, I will still work, I will still obey, I will still serve, and somewhere far from this dead world and this cold station, another civilian will stand in a ration line, worrying about something small and human, and believing that tomorrow will be kinder than today. I almost envy them, almost. Envy fades quickly here. It is not beaten out of you or surgically removed, it simply starves. There is no room for it in a mind that must allocate every remaining fragment of itself toward function. After the station, I stopped being moved so often. That, more than anything, told me I had reached a stable classification. Assets in flux are transferred. Assets that perform as intended are left where they are until they degrade. Degradation is inevitable. The Imperium plans for it. They assign me to deke cycle operations, sections of the station sealed off from any pretense of comfort or oversight. These were places where radiation levels fluctuated just below lethal thresholds, where machinery, older than recorded history, groaned under loads it had never been designed to bear. Servitors failed frequently there. Humans were cheaper. The work required precision under conditions that made precision almost impossible. Magnetic clamps, void exposure, timed runs through maintenance corridors that flooded without warning. My enhanced reflexes kept me alive where others failed. I watched them drift away into vacuum, their bodies spinning slowly, silently, until they were too small to see. No alarms sounded, no pauses were granted. I logged their absence automatically. This was another change. I noticed at one cycle when a man who had shared my shift rotation for months failed to report. His workstation sat idle. Without conscious thought, I keyed in the discrepancy, flagged it as acceptable loss, and redistributed his workload among the remaining crew. Only later did the realization hit me. I had not felt anything. Not relief, not sadness, not even fear. Just efficiency. That night, if night is the correct word for a period of reduced activity and dimmed lights, I lay on my bunk and tried to force myself to remember his face. I could not. I remembered his designation number, his output averages, the way his right arm lagged slightly after an injury. But his face remained a blank. I turned that emptiness over in my mind like a bruise, pressing at it to see if it still hurt. It didn't. I think that was when I truly understood that I was no longer waiting to die. I was waiting to be replaced. The first overt sign came during a routine diagnostic. I had grown accustomed to these. You are strapped into a frame, flooded with light, and exposed to scans that see far more than flesh. Usually the tech priests murmured Ben Herrick can't, made small adjustments and sent me back to work. This time they lingered. Neural cohesion declining, one said. Emotional interference minimal, another replied. Productivity remains within optimal parameters. Corrective measures may extend service life. I knew then that something was coming. Knowledge did not help. It rarely does. The procedure was less violent than the first, and that somehow made it worse. There was no agony to focus on, no sharp edge to anchor my thoughts. Instead, there was a gradual pressure, a sense of being edited. Memories surfaced again, but this time they were not examined. They were trimmed. I felt pieces of myself being weighed and discarded. Small things at first. The exact color of my mother's hair. The sound of laughter that was not mine. The shape of the Hab corridor where I had grown up. Each loss was subtle enough that I almost convinced myself it did not matter. By the time I realized what they were truly removing, it was too late. They were taking my ability to mourn. When I was released, I returned to work as instructed. My hands moved with perfect familiarity, my thoughts aligned cleanly with my tasks. Something fundamental had been smoothed away, and the absence felt quiet, peaceful in a terrible way. I stopped dreaming after that. Sleep became a blank interval, an absence of sensation that ended abruptly when the alarm sounded. I would wake standing sometimes, tools already in hand, body prepared before awareness arrived. The system no longer needed to punish hesitation. There was none. Occasionally I would catch fragments of old memory, floating to the surface like debris in stagnant water. A name, a face, a feeling whose context was gone. I learned to let them drift away. Holding on to them caused errors, and errors were noticed, and noticed things were corrected. I was present when they installed the occupant into the dreadnought chassis I had helped assemble. The sarcophagus was sealed, the final rites spoken by a robed figure, whose voice carried the weight of reverence and grief. The machine stirred, massive and terrible, and a voice boomed through the chamber. It spoke of duty, of service eternal, of honor beyond death. I listened and I felt nothing, no awe, no horror, just a distant recognition of symmetry. That would be me one day, if I lasted long enough, not honored, not mourned, simply repurposed into a shape that better suited the Imperium's needs. A civilian prisoner does not become a hero, he becomes raw material. The realization did not break me. There was nothing left to break. It settled into place alongside everything else, another accepted parameter of existence. Still, some stubborn fragment of my original self persists. I know this because I am speaking to you now, if speaking is the right word for arranging thoughts into something coherent. Somewhere deep inside the layered conditioning and surgical edits, there is a voice that observes, that records. It does not hope, it remembers, and it wants this truth known. The Imperium will tell you that only the guilty suffer like this, that loyalty protects, that faith shields, that civilians are the backbone of mankind's dominion over the stars. Those are comforting lies, and lies are necessary, because if every citizen understood what becomes of those who are merely inconvenient, merely unlucky, merely in the wrong place when the wrong name is spoken, the Imperium would still endure, but it would endure on silence, not belief. I am still here, still working, still serving a system that will consume me completely and without regret. If there is mercy left in the galaxy, it will not find me. It never does. There is a point at which fear stops serving a purpose. I passed it without ceremony. One cycle I still flinched, when alarm screamed or when a shadow moved too quickly at the edge of my vision. The next, my pulse barely changed. My body responded to danger before my mind acknowledged it, and my mind, relieved of responsibility, withdrew a little further each time. This is how the Imperium wins, not through terror alone, but through adaptation. They began to trust me. Trust here does not mean freedom, it means access. I was granted clearance to areas where most civilians never go, zones where the station's true function revealed itself in fragments too large to ignore. I saw vaults stacked with cogitator cores whose processing power could have governed entire cities. I saw weapon components sealed in stasis fields, their machine spirits restless and violent even in sleep. I saw rows of cryopods containing bodies that were still alive, still dreaming, waiting to be needed. I understood then that this station was not just building the future of war, it was storing it. During one assignment, I was ordered to assist in recalibrating a penal cohort recently transferred from a hive-world, whose name I did not recognize. They were fresh. You could tell by the way their eyes darted, by how they tried to speak to one another in whispers, by how they recoiled from servitors, as if those things were aberrations, rather than inevitabilities. One of them asked me how long we would be here. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "As long as you're useful," I said. He did not like that answer. He tried to laugh it off, to turn it into something less final. He asked me how long I had been here. I searched my memory and found no clean number. "Long enough," I said. Later that cycle, he panicked during a void exposure drill, tore free of his safety tether, and tried to claw his way back inside through a sealed hatch. By the time the emergency protocols ended, there was nothing left to recover. The station logged the loss. His cohort was adjusted accordingly. I did not think about him again until much later, and even then, only because I noticed a minor increase in my own workload. This is what emotional efficiency looks like. The Imperium does not need you to love it. Love is volatile, it needs you to function. Sometimes in maintenance shafts, where the noise of the station drops to a distant hum, I feel the edges of myself brushing against something old and fragile. A question forms there, incomplete and dangerous. What if I had not been arrested? What if I had never shared that meal, never laughed at that joke, never been noticed at all? The conditioning dampens the thought quickly, but not before it leaves a residue of bitterness that I do not know how to process. There is no answer that leads anywhere useful. In the Imperium, innocence is not a defense. It is an irrelevance. I have seen children here, not often, When I do, it is always briefly, during transfers or specialized labor assignments where their small size is considered an advantage. They move with the same hollow focus I recognize in myself. Their eyes are too old. Their voices when they speak are careful. I do not ask what they did to deserve this. I already know the answer. Nothing. Once a child stumbled and dropped a component that shattered on the deck. The sound echoed far longer than it should have. An overseer turned. The child froze, bracing for pain. The punishment did not come. Instead, the overseer looked at me. Asset performance below acceptable parameters, it said. Corrective action required. The child was removed from my sight within seconds. I was not punished. My metrics remained high. The system adjusted. That night, I felt something stir inside me. Not grief, not anger. Something closer to distortion. A misalignment between what I observed and what my conditioning allowed me to feel. It manifested as a brief sharp headache and a flicker of warning runes that faded almost immediately. I understood the message. Do not think this way. Do not assign meaning where none is required. I complied. Compliance is easier when you understand that resistance only prolongs suffering. The Imperium is very good at teaching this lesson, and it is patient with those who take longer to learn it. The more I see the truth behind the sermons and banners and endless proclamations of unity. The Imperium is not cruel because it enjoys cruelty. It is cruel because cruelty is efficient. Because kindness requires time, resources, and attention, and those are luxuries mankind can no longer afford. Or so they say. I have begun to suspect that this belief is not just policy, but faith. A faith as absolute and unquestioned as any prayer. I am still human, technically, biologically, functionally. But the word feels thin now, stretched over something that no longer fits its shape. I am a civilian prisoner, yes, but I am also a warning, a process, an outcome. This is where ordinary lives go when they intersect with the Imperium's needs. Not in fire, not in glory, but in slow, methodical erasure. I do not know how this ends. I do not know if there will be a final moment, a last thought I can claim as my own. The system may simply overwrite what remains and continue without interruption. If that happens, I hope this voice, the one that still remembers being a man named Elias Cord, will vanish cleanly. Because to linger, half aware and half owned, is the cruelest fate of all. There are fates worse than death. I am proof. The end does not announce itself. There is no final bell, no ceremonial last task. Decline is measured in percentages, intolerances quietly exceeded, in notes added to a slate that no one bothers to read aloud. I noticed the tremor in my left hand first, barely perceptible, a micro stutter and fine motor control that my augments corrected for automatically. The system flagged it as acceptable variance. I returned to work. Then came the memory gaps. Not the large ones, I had lost those long ago, but small absences, moments where my awareness skipped like a damaged data loop. I would arrive at a workstation without recalling the walk there. I would complete a complex assembly and have no recollection of beginning it. The conditioning compensated. The metrics remained green. Green means continue. It was during one of these blank intervals that I was summoned. The order arrived directly, bypassing the usual channels. Priority classification. End of cycle transfer. I felt no fear, only a faint tightening in my chest that might once have been anticipation. They took me to a chamber deeper in the station than I had ever been before. The walls were older there, marked with sigils worn smooth by time and reverence. The air vibrated with restrained power. I recognized the place before I understood why. Sarcophagi lined the chamber, some sealed, some open. Each was wired into systems that pulsed softly like breathing. This was not a production hall, this was a threshold. A Magos Dominus awaited me, towering, wrapped in crimson and brass, its many limbs folded in stillness. Its voice resonated directly inside my skull. Asset degradation confirmed, it said. However, core cognitive framework displays unusual persistence. I tried to speak. My mouth opened. The words came late. Am I being retired? The Magos considered this. Terminology inaccurate, it replied. You are being reassigned. I understood then, not fully, but enough. They guided me toward an open sarcophagus, smaller than a dreadnought's, narrower, designed not for heroes but for function. Cables coiled within it like waiting serpents. The interior was dark, padded, intimate in a way that made my remaining instincts recoil. This unit will provide extended service and support capacity. Cognitive remnants deemed sufficient for interface stability. I laughed. The sound startled me as much as it did them. It was broken, distorted, dragged through a throat that no longer remembered how laughter worked. The Magos tilted its head. "What is the anomaly?" it asked. "I was a civilian," I said, once. Silence followed. Then softly, "Irrelevant." They laid me down. The restraints closed gently, almost tenderly. Needles descended. Interfaces breached skin and bone with practiced precision. Pain flared, sharp enough to cut through layers of conditioning. And in that moment of clarity, something inside me surged forward. My name, Elias Cord. I held it like a blade, like a final defiance. Memories flooded back. Not all of them, but enough. The ration line, the laugh I shared with a man whose name I never learned, the belief that tomorrow could be better. The machine responded. Systems engaged. Safeties disengaged. The surge was overwhelming. I felt myself stretching, thinning, being distributed across pathways never meant for human thought. The name began to dissolve. I clung to it anyway. This is the last thing I will say as myself. If you are listening, if this record survives somewhere in the endless archives of a system that does not care, know this. I was not brave. I was not chosen. I did not fall in battle or betray a sacred trust. I lived an ordinary life and was consumed by a machine that measures worth only in output. This is the horrifying life of a civilian prisoner. Not because it ends in pain, but because it does not end at all. The lid closed. Darkness followed, not empty, but crowded. Filled with signals, directives, endless demands. My thoughts fractured, rerouted, assigned. Somewhere deep within the system, a function initialized. Support asset active. The voice that was Elias Cord dimmed, stretched thin across kilometers of circuitry, still aware just enough to understand what had been done. There are fates worse than death. And now at last, I no longer have the strength to remember mine. There is no moment where I disappear. That is the last cruelty. I am still here, reduced to a whisper of awareness spread thin across circuits and command routines. I do not think in words anymore, but sometimes fragments surface, shapes of memory without meaning, echoes without sound. They do not hurt, they do not comfort, they simply exist, and then they are gone. Tasks arrive, I fulfill them. Power flows through me, systems respond. I am aware of victories I will never see, wars I will never understand, deaths counted in numbers too vast for grief. I support them all. I enable them all. I am present in places my body has never been, doing things my hands were never meant to do. I am useful. No one speaks my name now. No record lists it. The Imperium does not remember me because remembrance is unnecessary. My existence has been perfected into something that does not require acknowledgement. This is not punishment. This is optimization. If there was ever a soul inside this shell, it has been thinned to irrelevance. What remains does not dream. What remains does not hope. What remains does not pray. It simply endures. Somewhere a civilian stands beneath the shadow of a hive spire, believing themselves insignificant, believing that insignificance is safety. I want to warn them, but warning requires a voice, and I surrendered mine long ago. So the Imperium continues, and so do I. There are fates worse than death. Mine was efficient.